Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to be talking about how to write effective descriptive writing, and what I mean by that is to elaborate on your ideas in order to create sufficient imagery for the reader. Good descriptive writing uses the senses, but it also zooms in and elaborates on a setting or a person, whatever it is you're describing, in enough detail to be able to recreate what you're imagining in the imagination of the reader. And the way you do that is by describing things in enough detail. This video is aimed at students that are aiming to get anywhere between grades 4 to 9, in other words, your GCSE pass. And regardless of the exam boards that you are following, there will be an opportunity somewhere in your course for English to write either descriptively, or write a story, or write creatively, or write imaginatively, whatever they want to call it. This video hopefully will be useful for you. Those of you who are following AQA know that you get an image, and the image is accompanied by a task like this, worded pretty much like this. Write a piece of description about a park as suggested by this image, and they give you the image. That image could be of anything, of course. In my mind, the most important word in this task is the word suggested, because that reminds us that this image is just a prompt. You don't necessarily have to follow this image at all, as long as you're writing about a park. This is just a prompt. So you're not supposed to be limited or restricted by the image, but it's designed to help prompt you to think about what you could use. So suggested is quite an important word. This image is not supposed to restrict you. So you're free, for example, to add things into the image. You're free to almost walk around the image, see this image as a place where you're stood, and see the image as something that's moving. Of course, the people in this image are moving in real life. The trees or the branches might be moving. So a picture, of course, is a still snapshot of a particular nanosecond of time, or in real life, things move. So see the image as something that isn't static, but something that is moving. What I mean by simplistic description is writing like this. These are all relatively short sentences. Technically, it's not really even descriptive writing, it's a list. So this would not be sufficient in order to get your grade 4 or above. This is not describing, it's listing. So we need to use this and improve it. And the way that we can improve writing like this is to make sure that we take the planning seriously. All good writers plan. 99% of students that do well with the writing tasks plan what they're going to say before they start writing. It supports you a lot. So if my students ended up writing something like this, it might be that they overlooked the planning properly and they didn't really know what they were going to say. So you need to make sure that you take the planning stage seriously, and that might be 5 minutes. It might take you 5 minutes to write or jot down some ideas, but believe me, those ideas will support you when you start writing your response. So one of the things that you could do when you're planning is to brainstorm or to spider diagram. And when I do this task in my lessons, I sometimes bring out the whiteboards. I sometimes get students to use flip chart paper or A3 paper, or sometimes cutting things out, sticking things down. I make the planning process very interactive in order to emphasize the importance of planning. So in that image, we've got 4 separate elements of that image. We've got the people, the mist, the bench, and the trees. And then what I would do is I would get students to elaborate and write around the outside of these words all the possible things or some of the things that they could actually refer to in the description of these things. So to give you an example with the people, think about what the relationship are, or what the relationship is between the people in the image. What are they wearing? What do they look like? What are they feeling or thinking? Where are they going? Where have they been? And describe how they're moving as well, the sound that they're making as they're moving. So you're beginning to elaborate a bit more on thinking about what it is about these people that you could actually refer to. You're not just saying there are people, you're giving more information. Then if we turn to the mist, you might say, for example, almost personify the mist as whispering. You might think of the mist as being like a wave in some kind of simile or metaphor described as washing over everything. You might say that the mist has a softness, or it's like a curtain, again, using a simile. You might use the verb cloaking to say that the mist is almost like, again, blocking the light out, cloaking everything in mist. And you might be using vocabulary like mizzling rain, which is a very kind of fine type of rain. You might use alliteration, granite grey, sky, and you might use vocabulary like sombre, ominous, and eerie, which helps to create an atmosphere or a mood in your writing. That can be often a quite successful thing to do as well. To use lots of words like a semantic field to reinforce the same mood. The bench, well, what is the bench made of? What does the bench look like? What's under the bench? So you might say the bench is wooden. The bench is weathered by lots of weather. You might say that there's a plaque on the back of the bench dedicated to somebody that passed away years ago, or that plaque is beginning to rust or tarnish. You might personify the bench as being solitary or lonely. You might say that there's a robin perched on the armrest. You might look down at the wood and see that people have carved in initials, maybe from lovers years ago. You might look under the bench and see that there are cigarettes that have been stubbed out on the floor. So you're zooming in and you're giving that great amount of detail. You're not just saying there's a bench. The examiner is kind of saying, well, tell me more. And finally, the trees. That was a very autumnal image, so you might say that there's an autumnal canopy of leaves. You might compare the leaves to yellow flames falling to the ground like confetti, for example, in a nice simile there. You might say that the branches were wearing fire. The bird song, you might use sibilants like rustling or whistling or whispering leaves to recreate the sound of that wind or breeze fluttering the leaves. You might refer to the fact that the branches, the skeletal limbs of those branches are arched over the path like some kind of roof over the centre of the image. And again, that creates more imagery. So what I mean by brainstorming is to really look at the basic elements of the image, the objects in the image, and then around the outside elaborating on some vocabulary, some devices, things that you intend to use when you start writing your answer. And of course, this would support a student in terms of, in effect, using some vocabulary and some devices in their writing. If you don't want to do a brainstorm, then you can do listing, and you could just list or bullet point things that you want to say or words that you want to use. So the black sentences here are, again, those relatively simplistic sentences from the beginning of this video. And underneath in blue, I've just simply listed one thing after the other of things we might be able to refer to in order to expand and elaborate on these ideas. So, for example, I'm still talking about the trees in that top example, but the blue underneath that sentence I could include and actually have multiple sentences about those trees, in which case the imagery is increased and I'm going into detail because I'm zooming in slightly more. Okay, so with descriptive writing, you want to say a lot about a little rather than a little about a lot. Okay, so zooming in is important. And the idea would be is you would turn these blue words or these lists into something more fluid and in a sentence or sentences in order to give that detail. So what does this all look like once you've planned? Well, it might be that you end up writing something like this, in which you are vividly creating as closely as possible the image of that picture that I showed you. The trees either side of the path looked like they were wearing fire, with a canopy of yellow displaying an autumnal panorama. A gentle whistling wind rustled through the leaves, which fluttered delicately to the ground like confetti. Above, the far-reaching limbs of the great oaks and elms arched over the path, from which birdsong rang out in a triumphant chorus. Overnight, a mizzling rain and granite sky had arrived, delivering a stubborn mist that cloaked everything in an eerie and sombre pallor. There was a softness in the air. In the distance, a little girl tightly gripped the cold hand of her parent after having fed the ducks in the local pond. In her other hand, an empty bag of bread with some discarded crusts. Wrapped in her pink anorak and scarf, she delighted in jumping into puddles, seeing her reflection wobble before returning to a stillness. Her red cheeks contrasted with the starkness of the mist, and so on. So, that's probably not the whole answer. It's okay if you can write that, but again, in 45 minutes, I would hope that students would be able to write a little bit more. Okay, so lots of good skills in here. We are using some devices. We've got some nice vocabulary. There's just a general confidence with punctuation, with words, with sentences. It's compelling to read, and it's also creating a lot of imagery. I could have not shown you that image, hopefully, and you would have read this, and you would have been able to picture that image quite closely in your own head because of the words that I'm using. Of course, this is easy for me to say because I'm an English teacher and I do this every day of the week. So for those students that are looking at this and saying, what can I do to write like that? What can I possibly do? Because there's no obviously medicine to take, there's no tablet to take, there's nothing you can drink to suddenly be able to write like this. That's because writing is like learning to drive, or learning to paint, or learning to play an instrument. It takes time. It's something you have to practice. It's a skill that you have to practice. And the most important thing that you can do, as well as practicing, is reading. So very simply, the answer is very simple. If you want to write like this in your exam, you need to read. And you need to read as much as you possibly can across lots of different types of text, both fiction and non-fiction, because that's how you're going to pick up words. So those of you that are familiar with the extract Jamaica in will know that that's about the weather in November, and the word mizzling is used in that extract to describe the rain. That's how I learned that word. Okay, about 10 years ago when I started teaching this specification, I didn't know that word before then. So I've read that extract countless times and I've learned that word and what it means. So in order to do yourself justice, you need to make sure that you read as much as you possibly can. And that increases the chances of you being able to write like this in preparation for your GCSE, ready for your GCSE. Okay, so this would be higher than a grade 4, I think, but obviously it's a comfortable grade, it's a comfortable pass, and you want to get as high a mark as possible. So if you're finding that your description is not detailed enough and it reads a bit like this, then perhaps you need to take the planning process with a bit more detail before you actually commit to writing anything on the page. Okay, so that is a video that hopefully has been useful in terms of how to elaborate and expand and zoom in and create evocative and vivid descriptive writing. Thank you.